Welcome everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Debika Ray, I'm a journalist and editor. I used to be the editor of Crafts magazine, and now I write freelance about architecture, design, craft, art and various other related things for the FT and others. It's great to see all of you here for this talk today on a beautiful sunny afternoon on a Friday. We're responding to an exhibition upstairs called Tracing Time, and this session is being held in partnership with the auction house Maak. You'll hear more about that from Marijke shortly, but they're showing ceramic works that respond to the works on paper on the wall upstairs, so do have a look at the exhibition if you haven't already after this. So today we're going to be exploring the parallels and contrasts in how drawing and ceramics are collected, appreciated and understood. I'd like to get quite swiftly into the conversation, but to briefly set a bit of context from my perspective. I write quite broadly about the arts, and I'm not a specialist, and as a generalist I meet artists working in a variety of mediums, and something that comes up really often is this question of wanting to blur disciplinary boundaries or not wanting to be labelled, and I think that's, I totally understand that and appreciate that, but I think that when it comes to collecting and valuing works, suddenly the question of labels and boundaries and disciplines comes into sharp relief, because collectors want to be able to know what something is, and suddenly it is important. And I think where it also becomes something that matters is the fact that whether you choose to pick up a paintbrush or you choose to pick up a needle or ceramics is often shaped by who you are, and that's kind of whether it's your background, nationality, culture, gender, and in turn that informs how works are valued. So I don't maybe need to convince all of you that disciplines matter because you're in this room, so you probably do agree, but that's a little bit of context from me. So luckily we have three experts in the room who can speak to this from a variety of perspectives, and they have a breadth of experience and knowledge, but to boil it down really simply, we have an expert on ceramics, an expert on drawing, and an expert on the intersections between the two. You can challenge those as we go. So I'm going to read out some brief bios, and please do expand on those in the conversation. Marijke Varrall-Jones has spent 25 years working in the fine art auction market, with more than 20 years devoted to specializing in contemporary ceramics. Marijke. She founded Maak in 2009, a specialist auction house and consultancy that has had an exclusive focus on contemporary ceramics and a dedication to supporting and elevating the studio ceramics market. More recently, Maak has broadened its specialism to encompass the wider contemporary crafts. Rupert Maas was born in 1960, the same year the gallery in Mayfair that his father, Jeremy Maas, founded. After a BA in art history from Essex University in the summer of 1983, he sailed the Atlantic, this is not in my words, in an attempt to avoid his responsibilities.
A friend of mine wrote my Wikipedia entry, and I've never forgiven him, and I've never found out a way of changing it.
Okay, I apologise for reading this out. On his return, he was tricked by his father into joining the Maas Gallery. Following the death of his father in 1996, he runs the gallery, which deals in Victorian, Pre-Raphaelite, Romantic and modern British art, along with the work of one living artist, Sarah Adams. Arthur Davis, in the middle, is a doctoral student interested in uncovering the plurality of artistic practices and creative networks in interwar Britain. Most recently, she has explored how the artist Therese Lesour and her sister, designer and craftswoman Louise Powell, employed ceramics to forge careers in the intersections of art, craft and design. Her PhD interrogates Lesour's engagement with the popular in subject matter and medium. She obtained an MA in the history of art from Birkbeck 20 years after graduating with a BA in mathematics from Emmanuel College in Cambridge. She spent much of the intervening period looking at and collecting both drawings and ceramics. Hopefully thorough enough and accurate. So since we're talking about ceramics and drawing, I think maybe starting with materiality and process might be a good place to start. So, and of course we're in this exhibition, so maybe let's start by talking about the works in the exhibition and what they mean. So maybe since it's an exhibition about drawing, we could start with you about, could you tell us a bit about the works upstairs?
Well, what I like about that exhibition up there, which I wonder if you do, which is the way that it spans thousands of years and many thousands of miles, and that is that interdisciplinary approach that it has, that I think modern collecting has. People are collecting less in any one area. Instead, they're looking for excellence or resonance, personally so, with things across many areas, and I really like the way it's hung, mixed and matched. My own contributions from our gallery, we do, having said all that, far too narrowly specialise in British art, particularly the pre-Raphaelites, and tracing their legacy through British art to the First War. And we've given a Burne-Jones drawing of the mother of one of his girlfriends, very strong Michelangelesque drawing. And we've also paid attention to the title of the exhibition, which is Tracing Time. And so we've got quite a cool watercolour of record, you would call it, that was originally commissioned by Ruskin of a carving on the west front of Auxerre Cathedral, which is 14th century AD. And then we've got a watercolour of Abu Simbel with this wonderful light coming through it in Egypt, of architecture that was built in 14th century BC. So I rather like that sort of bracketing. And then we've got easily the biggest and most colourful watercolour in the exhibition, I thought we'd do. By the Window, by Edward Reginald Frampton, of Saint Cecilia asleep and being woken by an angel. And that's because I'm a complete sucker for the romantic, and there it is, can't be helped, there it is. That's what we did.
Just to stay with you for a minute, it occurred to me when I was looking at the exhibition upstairs that it might be useful to actually have some definitions. So maybe this has stopped working. Could you tell me what drawing is? What does drawing mean to you?
Well, of course, it means a lot to a lot of many different things. Let's look not as somebody who came to a roadshow once and gave me a pebble with a scratch on it and said it's drawing in it. It's prehistoric, it's a drawing. It was just a scratch on a pebble, and that's his idea of drawing. But the 15th century idea of drawing was it was the armature, the central, most important discipline of all the arts, including architecture, including sculpture, which I suppose studio pottery is closer to than, I don't know, Clarice Cliff or Wedgwood. You know, I would say it's closer to sculpture. Drawing is the fundamental sort of underlying discipline of all art, is what I think. It doesn't help narrowly define it, but would you agree?
Yep. Well, yes, maybe let's turn to you, if you could tell us, respond to that, and then tell us a bit about the exhibition upstairs as well.
I think it is, and I think one of the things, it's exactly that it is the baseline for so many people, regardless of what their final material is in their art forms, that drawing still, for many of them, will form the foundations of that. And actually one of the things that I thought would be quite interesting to ask you is how the difference, it's probably a question for later, but I was interested to understand if there's any kind of value in terms of merit rather than value in terms of commercials for artists who choose to only work in drawing, and for those where it's a kind of a preliminary step to other work, but probably one to explore a bit later. But it's very much the foundation. Certainly a lot of ceramic artists, not all at all, but a lot of them will sketch out and make drawings of the works that they're planning to do, or they will also do drawings like Ewan Henderson upstairs, who also was a watercolourist and a collagist and charcoal drawings, in parallel to the works that he made in ceramic as well, even though the ceramics are his primary discipline.
So you're making a distinction between a preparatory sketch.
Yeah, I wasn't making a distinction. I was curious if there is a distinction.
Yeah, I think there very much is. I mean, and it generally, it's at that point where the artist adds his signature and puts it on the wall instead of in a cupboard, or for use later. I mean, Sarah Adams, the one living artist that we do represent, she won't sell her drawings because that's her library. She needs them, and for her they may have a value, but it's irrelevant. That's not why she's made them.
It's her thought process rather than the end product. Interesting.
So I think there is a big difference, but I think also drawings can work incredibly well on the wall. I just love a good drawing. It's like going from a major to a minor key in music, and you're in a house. You don't have all drawings. Perhaps it's a bit too narrow for me. I like a burst of colour, and something. Drawings is a very narrow aesthetic. Although I've seen. Have you seen houses where there are only drawings? Because I have, and it does work, but it's quite an ask.
And I think especially, upstairs is an expression of this, really. Demonstration drawings on monitor although historically in the 15th century they would have been one. I mean, the very title, Trois Crayons, of this this organisation, this exhibition, indicates a colour and a tone. So yeah, it's very interesting to me actually, those, and particularly the area I'm researching, is the area where artists worked across ceramics and fine art. And there's this wonderful moment at the beginning of the 20th century where some critics declare ceramics as plastic art in its most abstract form. So they're intentionally drawing that parallel between ceramic vessels, which previously had been quite utilitarian and, as you say, had been Wedgwood or highly manufactured, to something that was artful. And I think for me, as a kind of a collector, something that unifies the drawings and the ceramics, and you can disagree if you like, is that their kind of materiality and their immediacy carry something very sort of personal, something that earlier in the 20th century people would describe as the spirit of the artist, but also a lot of their heritage, what they've learnt, or even the mark of their hand. And there's that kind of immediacy that attracts a lot of people to preparatory drawings, I think. You know, it's the squiggle of the Michelangelo, but also something that attracts people to handmade studio ceramics.
The spark of making.
And I think also both,
I'm thinking.
yeah.
That's the disegno, isn't it? It's the thinking.
I think also it's that prehistory kind of connection where both drawing and ceramics are part of kind of prehistoric you know, human kind of creation, where the very first kind of, you know, cave drawings or kind of Neolithic pots, or, you know, all of those things that go back in time, you know, thousands of generations or thousands of years, that, you know, ultimately it links to something so much greater than just today. And I think ceramics and drawing both have that in common. And, you know, I think, you know, for those of you, I'll probably just step back and do the kind of definition of studio ceramics quickly as well. But ultimately, studio ceramics is a defined movement of ceramic production where one artist is ultimately responsible for the whole creative process. That ultimately they're conceiving the idea of the work. Often, certainly kind of in the earlier kind of generations, that they were perhaps even digging up the mud and chopping down the wood and you know, building their own kilns and then creating the pot, glazing the pot, firing the pot. That whole process was being made and conceived by one person. And, you know, on its most simplistic level, that's still the definition of studio pottery today compared to other kind of ceramic output. And it was a real contrast and reaction to the more kind of divided labour. There was kind of art pottery before studio pottery, which is kind of the period I think you kind of just before you kind of just after. Okay, interesting. But where ultimately, you know, there might have been a designer, and it might have been, you know, a very artistically recognised artist designer, but there was still then a different team of people and divided labour in terms of creating that ceramic piece. And so studio ceramics really started here in the UK in kind of early 1920s, and generally kind of Bernard Leach and Hamlet Shoji are considered the forefathers or the fathers of studio pottery. And, you know, it was as much a philosophy as it was a creative output and an art form. And there was a lot written about by Bernard Leach about the nobility of the craftsman and the anonymity of the craftsman. But, you know, and it was kind of linking Eastern philosophies with kind of British traditions in studio pottery as well. And a lot of it was very kind of country focused, the honest craftsman. And you had a highly educated Edwardian gentleman commending the anonymous craftsman while still trying to somehow make an income on it off his own back and off his own name. So it's fraught with anomalies in that sense. It's not a consistent narrative. But that's really kind of the foundations of it, and the Leach school and the Leach philosophies have, you know, are still continue to be very influential to lots of people still making today, but also form a really interesting kind of contrast for people to react against, certainly since the kind of the post-war era and alternatives coming from kind of Lucy Ree and Hans Koper and coming from Europe, and modernist thinking offered a real alternative language. And so I think today Leach is as influential for people who follow him as a reacting point ultimately for people to spark off in a different direction.
Do you want to say a little bit about the show upstairs as well, in terms of how to contextualise for people what
Yeah,
visually?
so I mean, it was a combination of wanting to bring beautiful things, and there's always that side of it, but we were considering quite carefully that concept of drawing, and that helped us select some of the work, sometimes as a contrast with the drawings that we knew would be here, and sometimes to try and kind of express those kind of crossovers. So Ewan Henderson was our starting point, really. We have some really great works, and he's an artist who really explores the extent that the ceramic material can really be pushed. You know, often his works are hand-built and very sculptural pieces, very abstract sculptural pieces, although his earlier works were often a bit more vessel-based. But ultimately he's really pushing that material to not reflect anything historic in that sense, so very much kind of looking forward in its own path. But he was also he also drew. We've got one of his charcoals and one of his watercolours upstairs as well. And whilst he's always been known as a ceramic artist, his drawing was a really important part of what influenced him and what he enjoyed in his making. So he was a starting point, and I think brought that really sculptural quality. And then sometimes you start looking for the contrasts, because sometimes you find the real quality in a work by putting something that really contrasts against it. So the Rupert Spira bowl, we think kind of sings really beautifully with that kind of beautiful kind of Chinese inspired chung glaze, in contrast to the very sculptural textural surfaces of the Ewan Henderson. And I like the fact that it's got an embossed poem in it, so you've got a line of text embossed into the surface in the well and on the underside, and again that kind of concept of text referencing drawing, and kind of the hand written in that sense as well, which we thought was interesting. Then we've got an amazing Liz Fritsch upstairs as well, which her work is very much focusing on kind of exploring the differences when you distort a three-dimensional object, and that, you know, the optical illusion of foreshortening. So she has this little technique where she kind of often will dip she'll dip the front rim of an object, so from a distance it will look very much more three-dimensional, and then you come close and actually it's almost in 2 dimensions, and then that surface, that two-dimensionality, is then broken through again by a contrast of floating 3D objects. So whilst drawing wasn't part of her part of her artistic repertoire, I think the influences of drawing are very important, and the techniques of drawing I think are really interesting. So that's some of the pieces we have upstairs.
You look like you're about to say something.
I always have lots to say, plenty, you know, but I thought the Elizabeth Fritsch was delightful, because that felt to me like, and you can agree or disagree, she's using a type of drawing which is important type of drawing historically, which is perspectival drawing. It's geometry, and it's recognising the importance of drawing to working things out on a mathematical level, which obviously appeals to me as well. So I can't recall actually if we've got any sort of perspectival or kind of plan drawings, but I know the days before CAD, you know, that was a core role of drawing, and perhaps Ruskin's work.
That sounds like my wife's text. She's an architect trained in traditional drawing, and she just missed CAD.
Yeah.
And she just laughs at these kids who design interiors, and the lift opens at the wrong place, and there's not enough room to get through a door, and the staircases don't connect to the walls because you can't see it properly. In CAD won't allow you to see the environment in a proper way. It'll just draw it for you when it thinks you want, and nothing connects, and so many silly mistakes are made by it. Sorry, I was going to say, are we familiar with the term paragone? Anyone heard of that? Hands up who has. Well, Tom has, of course, because he's brainy. But at university.
Should we ask Tom to define it?
Yeah, Tom, what's a paragone? Because that's what this is, isn't it? It absolutely couldn't be more of a paragone.
A historic competition between the arts.
Yes.
It's a comparison, isn't it? That's what it means literally, between the art of painting, well, the art of drawing and the art of sculpture. And since studio pottery, as you have set out, is closer to to sculpture than it is to, I don't know.
For some, I think
For some.
some potters would argue strongly against that.
Yes.
But
Oh, would they?
certainly, yeah, I think so. I think there are some potters who feel very strongly linked to the vernacular kind of British pottery tradition and see themselves as a continuation of that, and they're making functional objects to be used. So there's a lot of plurality within ceramics. You know, they're all using similar materials, but actually their philosophies are very contrasting. But I think certainly the pieces we brought here are much more sculptural
They're very
focused.
plastic, aren't they?
Yeah.
And Benvenuto Cellini's memoirs, he
Yeah.
talks a lot about drawing in the plastic medium of silver. And so I think that was all part of the Paragone.
Yeah.
And here we are having the same discussion that Leonardo and Vasari and people covered.
Yeah.
You know, exactly the same arguments. It really is.
And I think this question of is ceramic sculpture, I think you rightly pointed out, is a very personal thing, but I think we are quite affected by what happened at the birth of the studio ceramics movement, if we can call it that, where it really did enter, it had been outside, if you like, the environ of art. It hadn't been considered an art form at all. It was, you know, it was very much discredited by, as you described, this sort of divided labour of whether it be the art pottery. It was a very gendered divider of labour. Guess you did the painting. It wasn't you. You did the sculptural forms, and the sort of the industrialisation of Wedgwood. But we're very affected by that, and that really entered the realm of art by sort of recasting ceramics in the language of art, which talked about sculpture, which talked about abstraction.
And it was only quite a brief period of time, and actually very few ceramic artists who kind of fell into that category. So William State Murray is kind of was at the forefront of that, and he was part of the 7 and 9, and all sorts of, you know, showing alongside Ben Nicholson and things like that.
You're too young to remember the sale at Phillips of ceramics, when a madman burst in with a baseball bat and destroyed the entire sale.
I do know that story.
You hear that one?
I do, yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, you're quite right, that there was very short periods, but I do think what's really exciting
it's been the underlying kind of battle for ceramics for such a long time.
And I think that's what makes it interesting from a collecting point of view and an academic point of view, is because there was so much going on after that. But anyway, I think we interrupted your point on Paragone.
Oh, I don't want to hog it.
No, go.
All right, okay, well, I was just going to say that because, as I remember it, the argument went that the sculptors said that three-dimensional form was much better at describing the real world than the artificial construct of a perspectival drawing, which is what you were talking about, that kind of architectural detail and record, because a blind person could hold it and have some experience of what it actually was, whereas of course with a drawing you couldn't see it at all. And which I thought was rather a good sort of direct argument. There is that tactile quality to what you are, what you are showing.
And I think that tactile quality is something that's kind of really a fundamental draw to what brings people to ceramics.
Well, except that your labels say, please do not touch.
Yeah, we prefer people buy them then touch them, preferably. But it is, and actually the beauty of our auctions is, for people who come to our auctions, is that there is that opportunity. You can handle everything. You know, we're not a museum, and everything can be handled. And for a lot of people, that's so important. You know, having that opportunity to see things in person rather than just photographs. But people need to pick it up. People need to feel the weight of it. They want to feel the quality of the glaze on their hand. And I think it is that, you know, that tactile haptic quality that is so important for ceramics, and what draws people in.
Yeah, and I, just to play devil's advocate, I don't often see a sign inviting you to stroke a drawing.
Well, it's not going to get you very far, is it? Really? Yeah, that's the thing. Whereas with sculpture, there's always that yummy.
I'm really enjoying this because I'm not having to do any work at all. But I do want to shift the conversation a little bit to kind of the art market. And you talked about people who define themselves as potters as opposed to artists. And it's all well and good people trying to define themselves, but really there's a bigger context around it. So I wanted to talk a bit about, well, maybe starting with Emmy, you talked about how your interest is in that moment in the early 20th century when, say, ceramics moved from pottery to the art market to kind of loosely, I mean, you can
Very
expand on that, but what were the conditions? Can you explain a little bit about the context? How did that happen, and who were the players, and what brought that about?
Yeah, and to start, I think it's very dangerous to define any one moment, and this
Sure.
is a moment in Western Europe and particularly in Britain. But you had a lot going on at that moment as sort of modernism was developing in Europe. And you think of your sort of continental modernists who were declaring that ornament was a crime, as Alfred Lewes was declaring. And you also had the post-impressionists were starting to make an impact on the British market. So Roger Fry had his big exhibitions. And this idea of abstraction was coming into British art. You had the Omega workshops, were a very early instance of this, which were trying to take, they were run by Roger Fry from 1913 to 1919. And some people feel that they were really using things like ceramics and textiles as a medium through which to introduce this concept of abstraction. So you suddenly had these works which were meant to be utilitarian but were being sold to middle upper class patrons, if you like, the same people who were going around the contemporary art galleries and appreciating post-impressionist art. And suddenly that language by which people were starting to describe art, there's a very famous book called Art by Clive Bell, that came out in 1914, which talked about art as being significant form. And it started to talk about art in terms of abstraction that really made it possible to include ceramics in that definition. So that's not the only reason. There are lots that you can talk about Bernard Leach and his history and his return. And at the same time, it's very interesting to see this reaction against industrialization and going back to the single potter being involved. And the other key people, apart from the art market, I would say, is institutions. I think institutions still play a big role. And one of those that plays a huge role in studio ceramics and collecting right now, the V&A, actually played a huge role as well. It's not meant to be a history lecture, but there was a really influential curator called Bernard Rackham, who was keeper of the ceramics department. And he teamed up with another very influential art critic called Herbert Reed. Some of you might have heard of him. And they wrote this really influential book in 1924, 1925, someone will correct me on YouTube, which was a historical survey of English pottery. And it only went up to the 18th century. It basically went up to the point where Wedgwood started industrialising things. And they went back to that old English pottery, which you mentioned, that kind of Thomas Toft slipware. And they started talking about it in the same terms as abstract art. They talked about this English slipware as being significant form. And it really sort of developed this, both a language for ceramics as art, but also a heritage. This was in the 1920s. We had lots of nationalistic anxieties at the time as a nation. And it was really linking English pottery as a national art. And that really prompted a lot of interest in that from collectors at the time. So there were lots of things conflating at that time. I've not even mentioned politics and economics, but it created an environment where ceramics started to be shown. You mentioned William State Murray. He had an exhibition of his ceramics alongside Ben Nicholson, the draftsman, who I think has a work upstairs, in the Beaux Arts Gallery just across the road from here. It was 1927. And it was that time when suddenly that paragone, whether it was paragone or equation of forms, suddenly started happening physically in galleries. And it's quite an amazing moment. I wish I'd been there, but.
Rupert, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the trajectory of drawing in the context of kind of galleries. How has that come to the fore as something that people value as something to buy in itself rather than being...
It's fascinating. Sorry, just saying.
I can go on, sorry, you must stop me.
Yeah, well, I'd quite like to hear the economics and politics chapters now. It's really good. Anyway, drawing. Well, you can blame Devine, I think, for the idea that drawings aren't really worth much. Because he was the one who persuaded all those sort of railway men in America, oil men, that the way to immortality was a collection of oil paintings because they lasted longer. But there was a time in Victorian Britain when watercolours were called paintings. There was no distinction between the media, and now drawings. In my gallery, I love drawings. I've had masses of drawing shows and traded in thousands of them over the years. But I've had to deliberately rein in my love of them for commercial reasons. I can't sell them enough. There isn't enough margin in them to pay the ridiculous rent of my shop. And
why is that? What does it keep maintain at that kind of? Why hasn't that changed?
Why hasn't that changed? Because what I'm saying is people have inherited this idea that there's a hierarchy in art forms.
To do with
and
permanence?
Oil paintings at the top of it.
Yeah. To do with the material and the permanence of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not studio pottery,
Yeah.
and certainly not drawings.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because ceramics, you might say a lot of craft material mediums have I guess there's a sense that maybe they're less permanent in some way. They can change. They're kind of organic. They're evolving. Do you think that affects how people value and think about it?
It is. I think certainly before people become more comfortable and familiar and confident with it, there is that fear that ultimately it's a fragile object. But also it's a fragile object that's sustained a firing of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. So it's actually quite hard wearing as well. And unless you're going to start knocking things off shelves, there's not many pieces that I can think of that if they're just left in peace are ultimately very stable and long lasting. And it's not for any reason at all that we still find intact Roman ceramics and things like that. And in many ways kind of ceramics have been the most enduring of many of the art forms.
And drawings of watercolours are incredibly fragile still.
Yes, exactly.
Museums are very wary of taking them on. It's such a responsibility, a curatorial responsibility, light levels, temperature, humidity and things. And they just see it as vanishing in front of their eyes the minute they put it on the wall for people to look at.
Yeah, whereas with ceramics having that much more stability, whilst I think the perception is of them being much more fragile and vulnerable, I think actually that's not really the case.
No, I'd agree.
And I close my curtains every time I go out the house, which is rather sad. If it's a sunny day, my front room, the curtains are closed because I have prints and drawings on the wall. I mean, they're not stuck away in a plan chest like in museums.
I get pangs of guilt. I've got a small collection of ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and I get pangs of guilt because I've got no curtains in my bathroom where I keep them, which it could not be more wrong, but love them anyway.
I had a question for both of you about the status of your works, and I wondered how much scale plays a role in that. Because drawings typically there are some monumental drawings upstairs, but drawings generally tend to be on the smaller scale, tend to be scaled up if they're preparatory, or if they're a watercolour, they're very intimate scale. I wonder how much historically, and I can think in the contemporary art market at the moment, scale is quite a defining factor in status. And I wanted to ask the same about ceramics, because whether ceramicists today felt the need to go bigger and bolder and not just make those small tea bowls.
I don't think that plays a part with ceramics really,
No.
because I think ultimately, each ceramic artist or potter has their own creative output. And for some of those artists, yes, scale might be an important factor because that's an important work for them when they're working on scale. But if you think of someone like Hans Koper, for example, as his earlier works are generally on a much larger scale, and as his career progressed, he would take a form and explore a form and repeat a form over a period of time until he felt that he'd finessed it and taken it to the point of its ultimate essence. At which point he would then move on to another form, and they're all kind of linked and flowing, they're following the same language. But actually the works on a commercial level.
He likes an LP rather than a single.
Yeah, exactly. And there are kind of families of pots, you see that with his work very clearly. But actually towards the end of his career, the works that, from a commercial perspective are certainly the most valuable, are actually the smallest works that he made, and they're his kind of arrowheads and his cycladic forms.
Oh, yes.
And actually it's almost like it's a concentration of everything that came before reduced to its most pure point in those very small works. So it's really very much dependent on the artist. For some people, yes, it would be the larger the work, the better.
Yeah.
But then again, on a commercial scale, not everyone can house those. So you might have a hugely important, very significant piece from that artist's output, but you're going to have a very limited number of people who have somewhere to live with it.
Well, yeah, it's a practical consideration.
Exactly,
And I have
it
artist
is.
friends who tell me that their gallerists have said, you need to make a few more small pieces this
Exactly.
year because we can't sell the big ones.
And
So I mean, how do gallerists and auction houses going to play a part in shaping the collection market for these things then?
I think it's often driven by the collectors, you know, certainly with the auctions that we have, and I think it's happening more and more that private collectors are buying at auction. But certainly when I started kind of 20 years ago in the ceramics department at Bonhams, it was quite unusual that I'd say that even then kind of 95% of our buyers and sellers were all private collectors. So we weren't selling to trade, we were selling to the kind of the end user, so to speak. And so they were almost determining, you know, what they had room for. And I think when the American market's been very strong, it has made it possible that they're often buying bigger pieces because of the environments in which they're living in. They've got more space to accommodate them. And I think a big, you know, we sold a private collection earlier this year from Maak and Diane Grainer, who are based in Washington. And they had this extraordinary collection of British studio pottery that they had in their home in Washington, and often they were able to buy the biggest and the best pieces by an artist because they had room for it where British collectors wouldn't have had room to accommodate something like that. So that it plays an influence for sure.
What you said about the auctions selling to private customers was very interesting to me, because mostly what auctioneers sell is what already sells, your commission agents, not acting as principal, buying it first, then selling it on. Not that that's a criticism, because I think uniquely, actually, in studio pottery, the auctions led the way. They seem to have made well, they didn't make the market, but they enabled the making of the market in a way that normally it's dealers that are at the front of these things, but it does seem to me that studios being sold at the death of the maker, it suits the auction process extremely well. And there have been a series of, I couldn't give you names and dates or even the auctioneers, but I've noticed these moments when a studio has come up and everything has changed. I think it happened with Bernard Leach. Suddenly, there was a studio sale and there was an exponential leap in price, and it was
certainly the Lucy Ree studio collection, the
certainly
sale of
there,
a lifetime,
yes.
which was. I'll not say the name because I'll probably get the date, but I'll probably get it wrong. But you know, that was a really seminal time.
Yeah.
But I think actually in a lot of ways, it's when important private collections come onto the market have almost had more defining times in terms of market changes, because you know, not only are you people are buying into the taste and the eye of a collector, and if it's an important and well-respected collector, there's, you know, certainly that kind of stamp of approval that it's come from that collection and it must be a good piece, and I think that helps. But it also brings forward the importance that this was something that was very kind of regarded by one collector,
what
and
about
that fuels other collectors.
plurality? So you know, you were saying a group, but I mean with pictures, people want just one big statement quite often, which is one of the reasons why drawings aren't quite so commercially successful anymore. It used to be that you decorate your house with lots of things, but now they just want one thing that says, here it is, and then the walls are just an even colour and there's one or two great things. Does that happen with pots? I mean, because I think
it's changed a lot.
I think one of your pots would look great on a pillar, lit on its own, in an empty room.
Yeah,
It's
I
fantastic.
think some works absolutely stand on their own, very much so in that sense. And I think there's been a real shift in collecting patterns over the last, even the 20 or 30 years, where, you know, in the 1990s, people almost took the V&A book, Oliver Watson V&A book, as a checklist. And they would collect a representative name of as many people from the V&A kind of collections book, and that's how they live with their collections. And you know, many houses and collections that I've seen, you have that. Every surface is crawling with pots.
Yeah, you see, you don't get that. You don't get that in drawings anymore.
And I think that has changed. You still have collectors like that, but not as many. And I think much more people are curating their home spaces in the way that changes how they buy and how they collect, because everyone's having a more aesthetic approach. So they're finding parallels between works or buying things in isolation without having the need to have every representative piece by that artist or artists that they were, you know, contemporaries of.
To say I have very little to say on this because I'm clearly the exception to the rule, because I have to reorganise my house every time I've made another purchase. So I am clutter defined. And just before I came out today, I was trying to sort of lean some stuff and move some stuff out of the way of the wall, because I've got my parents coming to stay this weekend and I need to make space for them to live. So there we go. I'm the exception to the rule.
If there's a need to kind of expand or desire to expand the market of collectors and, you know, attract new collectors and younger collectors, how does that play into the role of drawing and ceramics? I mean, from a kind of outside perspective, it seems like there's an appeal among younger buyers to, well, certainly smaller objects, but, you know, in terms of craft and tactile objects, but drawing as well. I mean, it seems like maybe younger collectors may not be so wedded to what has traditionally been considered valuable. Do you think that changes how you operate and how you work?
When it comes to drawing, I think personally, I think it's about process, and if you understand how things are made or why people make them, then you're much more likely to appreciate a drawing. And so I would encourage people to go to degree shows. They're happening right now. Well, actually, some of them are over, but June is the time. And go and meet the kids who've just been taught how to make these things. And you may not like what all of them do, but you'll get an idea of process. And it's really interesting to engage with that. And it helps me understand things much better when I talk to them. But
has the profile of your collectors changed over time as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely they have. I worry that people aren't terribly interested in old stuff in the way that they used to be. You know, I've just said myself, go and meet the kids, you know, coming out of the art schools. There are far too many of them, really. And so I'm not sure it's a sustainable model, honestly. Yeah. You know, don't you think there are too many artists?
Oh, well,
I'm not
sorry.
answering that question.
Ceramics artists. You can answer that from the ceramics point of view.
No, thank you.
Not too many artists.
Yeah, well, as a collector who was once a young collector, I think there's dual appeal of ceramics and drawings. Actually, they're an accessible entry point to something that is a unique work. The same with original prints, which is my other area of weakness. And I think that exactly, you put your finger on it. The thing that attracted me was the variety of processes that are involved in drawing, whether it be mediums, whether it be the purpose of the drawing, and the same could be said of ceramics. But there is also a barrier to entry. Part of it is knowledge when you go back 500 years, and there is a lot of scholarship behind you, and part of it is, to be honest, jargon. There's quite a lot of there's quite a lot of jargon in the drawings world when it comes to medium. I mean, the title of Trois Crayons sometimes needs
Americans can't say it at all. You've got to change it. They can't. They say Trois Crayons.
But that gives us all a laugh, and that's nice and fun.
Not laughing.
But in ceramics, I mean, I find that fascinating. But But you talk about the materials and the techniques and the glazes and what's the difference between stoneware and earthenware, and I think that's both something that intrigues, but is possibly a barrier to entry. So I just wonder if you could talk about whether you think it is.
Yeah, I mean, we try to stay clear of too many technicalities. I know that lots of people love knowing what cone something was fired to, or what temperature, or was it a reduction firing, and honestly, I couldn't answer the question for half of those, because it's not where my focus is. I'll let the makers who really know about that. That's what they, that's the technical knowledge, and I don't need to be too involved in that side of things. We try, there are characteristics that are intrinsic to the nature of the material. So I think it is significant to understand whether you're looking at a stoneware object or a porcelain object or an earthenware object. So there are technicalities that I think are significant to know, but ultimately the only thing that matters is whether the piece speaks to you. And I think the rest of it comes later. And I think for a lot of our newer collectors, that tends to be how people approach it now, where you know, it starts with sometimes quite a modestly priced piece. You know, with the auctions that we do, we're selling things everywhere from kind of £200 to £200,000 and more. So, you know, there is a huge range. And again, talking about that accessibility, that was, you know, very consciously done, because we want to be encouraging those next generations of collectors to be able to come in. But I think the first thing that draws people is whether they like the piece, and it can be as, you know, superficial as that initially, and then what we tend to find is that people buy something they've fallen in love with, and then they come back and they see more, and they start going and seeing ceramics in other places, and it becomes a process that becomes, you know, very much part of that person's joy and collecting journey. And I think you can take small baby steps. You don't have to know everything before you commit to it. And I think that process is as much part of the joy as the works themselves for people.
We're close to the end, so I wanted to bring in some audience questions. So is there anyone, or we can pass around my mic if there are any.
I have a
Or you
question. Any of you connected with the galleries, whether selling or having auctions, do you also have permanent collection, which is like always for you to show the people what you are interested in?
No, I'd say we always have very much revolving stock. We always have ceramics in our office, and that, you know, people can come and see any time, but we don't have a permanent collection. I think part of the joy of the auction process is that we have an auction every 6 months. We bring things together for a period of time. We get to curate the sales, select what comes together, do our research. We get to live with it in our office, which is a really wonderful thing to be able to do for 6 months. And then, you know, things find a new home, and then we get to do that process again with a new group of work. So for us, it's ever evolving. We don't have a permanent collection in the way that you've defined.
And so
In my business, stock by definition is unsaleable.
I see.
But I have my own collection at home. I wouldn't call it a collection, it's just stuff I really like, or that I could afford to keep. It's not necessarily in my area.
So it is to stay.
It's to stay at home. I love it.
But do you ever show it?
Well, funny you should say that, because I've just offered it to this little space that Leighton House has in the basement. Just to show some of the things I've got, but only.
That's interesting.
I'm not really very public about it. I just thought it would look nice there. You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you say
But
what
it's
you?
good to show, I think.
It can. I think it's good to share in that way.
Yes,
I
to share, not for sale.
No, I rather agree.
If
But,
you like something special.
but my friend Julian, who's an art dealer, he says that art dealers should not collect because their customers might get jealous and think that you kept the best things for yourself. I have not done that. I've just bought what I could afford to keep, and you know, otherwise I'm a total tart. I'll sell something I love.
Yeah, this is why I can never be a dealer.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
I want to know a bit about what all of you collect now. What do you have? What
What's
are your
going to
some
Leighton
highlights?
House, or is that not?
I've inherited some drawings from my dad, who I adored, and we shared a lot of particular love. I've got some drawings by William Henry Hunt, and there are several in Trois Crayons upstairs. Or are there? No, they're in another show elsewhere in St James's.
Jones upstairs.
There's a Burne-Jones upstairs. I don't have a Burne-Jones, unfortunately. I couldn't afford to keep one of those.
Opportunity.
I know. I've kept lesser names as well. I haven't kept. The art market revolves around brands, and you know, there's room only in some people's heads for like 30 brands, and Burne-Jones is a brand, and if he ever stops being a brand, then there'll be room for another brand instead on that top table of 30 names. But just at the moment, I can't see the point of. I've got several in stock, so I own them technically, but they're not in my house. You know, I've kept lesser names.
Which I think is a really interesting thing about collecting, if you're doing it from a point of view of once you've had that hook and you've collected maybe a couple of brand names, and you start to read around, you start to uncover the names that aren't brand names, and they will probably be, they might be the names that are going for £200 in your auctions. And I think it's really important to keep doing that if you are seriously interested in collecting. not because you're trying to find someone who's going to appreciate and value, but just because you're recognising that there were more people than Lucy Lee and Hans Koper making ceramics after the Second World War. And I think it's very easy for the market to be led by people wanting a trophy piece, and if there are more collectors who only have space for one piece on their wall, they're going to want to Burne Jones and not be interested in this huge plurality of, I mean, this isn't the first time there have been far too many people graduating from art school.
No.
Slightly less 100 years ago or 50 years ago, but there were still a lot more artists than necessarily made the headlines. So I think that's what I'm intrigued by when I collect.
We can come back to what you both have in your collections, but let's just see if there's any more questions in the audience.
I was going to ask you, Marijke, do you seek out the drawings of ceramics?
I think I'm always interested when seeking out is difficult, because I think if there's an opportunity to show them, especially if we can contextualise them with works that will show kind of the three-dimensional works that will show in colour, I think it's always really interesting to show that other side of the artist. So I'm always keen to have that opportunity. But certainly with most ceramic artists, it's almost a side project for them, and I think sometimes you want to do the works justice, whereas because I think sometimes, so for example, like Ewan Henderson's kind of paintings, I think are absolutely fabulous. I've got 2 or 3 myself at home, but he's not a name that a picture dealer would know as an artist. A ceramics collector would know the name Ewan Henderson, but they wouldn't necessarily then go and expect to see one of his works on paper. So I think sometimes you almost need a slightly different context and have an opportunity to show them side by side to broaden the understanding of that artist. And I think showing the drawings does that, but it's not necessarily a commercial decision. I think it's a personal interest or an interest in wanting to show the wider context of that artist rather than a commercial decision.
Actually sell the drawings as well?
Yeah, we have done. Yeah, we have done.
Do people tend to buy them in isolation or as
No, I think quite often it will be someone who knows that artist, has collected that artist, and then sees this as an important part of understanding the three-dimensional works by having this. But they're usually people who are kind of already quite deep into collecting that artist, and so it almost becomes of academic interest to them, not just a collecting, not just being bought on its own merit. It's got that kind of other elements and context for it.
And is that the context in which you have those works?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I think it's understanding, it's fostering that understanding of that artist is certainly our motivation when we're selling those.
Yeah, and I think that made me think that you don't get many cross-medium, cross-disciplinary auction or gallery sale opportunities. There are few. So in the modern British big sales at Sotheby's and Christie's and Bonhams, you'll now see a couple of iconic Madeleine Odundo, and you'll see Lucy Lee, but that's a couple. I've seen some sort of delicious kind of etchings and drawings by Bernard Leach come up, but they come up in prints and drawings auctions. And so I think what you're doing is really interesting. What's upstairs is quite rare to see that true mixing of media, both of which have an equal precedence. There's not one that's above the other.
There's an interesting segue into the fact that you're expanding beyond ceramics as an auction house. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that touches a little bit on my personal collecting as well, because it's so contemporary. Clearly, ceramics isn't the only craft form. It's one material within kind of contemporary craft on a wider level, but it's certainly the one that's been the most well defined on a kind of commercial market level, and the secondary market for contemporary ceramics has been quite vibrant since the kind of 1980s or late 1970s even, and so I think it's had much more exposure and I think is more defined, and I think perhaps has been someone like Bernard Leach has written so much. They've built this whole philosophy around it, which I think has helped define it and give it that historical context and that link historically as well. And so the wider craft market just hasn't had that same exposure and that same kind of support, because ultimately the way I see it, auction houses should be focusing on the secondary market, and that supports everything that the galleries can do on the primary market. You know, they're doing so much important work to build a market for the artists and to promote the artists, and there's a huge amount of work that goes into that is a completely different skill set to what an auction house does. So we then work with that, works will filter through a private collector and then come through onto the secondary market, and that's where we have a kind of an obligation and responsibility, as I see it, to help build a strong secondary market. And I see it as an ecosystem that really everything, if everyone's doing their job well, everything supports each other, and you have a healthy market at that point. And that's where I see our role, and I think everything that I've done over the last 20 years with contemporary ceramics, and certainly with Maak and everything that I've done with Maak since 2009, we thought we could apply those learnings and that approach to how we build the market to contemporary craft on that wider level, because it isn't something that has been done consistently and with a real focus in the way that has been done for ceramics for a much longer time.
But there must be some commercial risks in doing that. I mean, if it's not a market that really exists, and you have to invest in it.
I think so.
Right.
Well, risks. I think we've got the infrastructure and the ability to do it in a way that we can let it grow organically. We do them in parallel to the ceramics auctions, and so there's a commercial approach to it that allows us to do it. And give it time to grow. I think you can't start building these markets and expect it to suddenly be a huge financial success. 1 or 2 auctions in, you've got to give it the room to grow and the room to, for people to understand it and see it. And I think for any artworks, the more time people have to spend with it and see it, you start building those longer term relationships and that understanding. And so that's what we were fortunate enough to be able to do with the craft auctions that we do now.
Any more questions? Yes.
Just a quick one. You say contemporary ceramics and contemporary crafts, and earlier on everyone talked about how the market, it's important that there are definitions between what people are buying and what auctions perhaps are saying the objects are. So in ceramics, contemporary ceramics, is there still would you definitely have, say, like if an object that was a vessel that could be functional but really isn't, that would really go on a shelf? How do you talk to your collectors about one thing being craft, one thing being art, or do you not, or is there a definition?
I tend to not so much. There's a huge amount of makers who would call themselves ceramic artists who are still very much wedded to the vessel form, which ultimately has that connotation of function and that reference to function and historical forms, but they have never been made with the intention of being used. And then you have, in parallel to that, you have potters who are making things that are very beautiful, very technically proficient, but the idea was that they're making lots of them and they want them to be purchased to be used and are priced to reflect that. And I think, and there's almost everything in between as well. I do know people who will buy a Lucy cup and saucer and they have every intention of using it and do, whereas for someone else buying a Lucy cup and saucer, it's a really prized object that will sit on a shelf high up where no one's ever going to touch it for fear of anything happening to it. So I think sometimes the context of a piece is in the beholder, and sometimes it's in the concept of the artist and what their intent for it was.
What about dishwashers?
Oh, I know someone who's put their Lucy in the dishwasher, yeah.
I don't have the same problems with drawings. Any more questions? No, it seems like we've wrapped up exactly on the dot of time. So if maybe we could have a finishing word from each of you, maybe something to do with, we could start with what these intersections between drawings and ceramics, what do you hope that by encouraging that, what do you hope that will do to a kind of market of collectors, or what kind of perceptions of the two mediums?
I think my perception is that both ceramics and drawings are probably drawing quite a niche group of collectors with niche focuses, but ultimately no one collects in isolation, no one lives with a type of object in isolation, and none of these works are conceived in a vacuum either. I think every artist is influenced by 101,000 things around them, and it's not only the medium that they're working in that influences them. And I think any opportunity which I say contradicts what I do, considering that Maak is an auction house dedicated to contemporary ceramics and craft, but I still believe that actually an opportunity to see things with other contexts and alongside other types of objects is always really valuable in helping understand what you love about the things you already collect and what might draw you to other areas as well.
Lee has
Maybe
the
you
last
could
word.
also say something. Also say something about your own collection. Because
Yes.
you
Well, I was
remember.
saying, oh goodness, no, that would take me too long because I'd have to try and rationalise it in my own head. But I think the thing for me, and I am not a dealer and I'm not working in the auction market, so I speak a little bit as a collector and a bit as an academic, but two things that draw me both to ceramics and to drawings, and I collect both in a small way, and prints, original printmaking. But drawings and ceramics, I think you touched on earlier, was that they both are sort of the most ancient forms of expression, and they've also developed, and they are universal, so they are global. So we've got quite a focus on kind of British studio ceramics upstairs, but there are global connections. And I think what really excites me both historically and looking at contemporary artists is that using these very material, tactile forms, artists are able to make lots of references, not just abstract sculpture in ceramics case, but to all sorts of narrative and symbolism. And the same with drawing. You've got, you know, thousands of years of drawing history and, you know, kind of all of the paragone and all of the sort of historical debates and all of the big names, and artists today are in dialogue with that, right? So there's so much exciting depth to explore in both of these mediums. And at the end of the day, they are just lovely to look at or to hold as well. So you can like them or you can dislike them. So I think you can go into all that intellectual stuff, but you can also just find something that you can live with on your wall or on your shelf. So I think that, yeah, I think it's quite possible to collect both. And I don't think they need to be a niche, would be my closing thought.
Right. Well, personally, I think all art's human expression. I'm emotionally incontinently unable to resist something that I like and is within my reach. So I just sort of get it, and I think we should all do that. It's like it's life. You know? Okay.
That seems like an excellent point to stop. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for